Every year on Tisha B'Av, we tell the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. It's a story that's been around for a very, very long time, but it's a story that still hits us in the heart every single time. The Gemara talks about a party that was thrown by an individual, and in the midst of the party, he says, "I'd really like to have my friend Kamsa here." So he sends a servant out to go find Kamsa and to invite him to the party. And the servant goes out, and unfortunately, he made a mistake, and instead of bringing Kamsa, he brings Bar Kamsa. Now, the servant didn't know that Bar Kamsa and his master were enemies. They didn't like each other very, very much. But Bar Kamsa, I guess, had felt that, oh, maybe we had surpassed the animosity between us, and he came to the party. And he sat there, and he's enjoying himself. And all of a sudden, the host comes out, and the host sees Bar Kamsa there. And he looks at him with a scowl and says, "What are you doing here?" He says, "What are you talking about? You invited me to the party." He said, "I would never have someone like you at the party." And he says, "I want you to leave." Bar Kamsa is terribly embarrassed. He says, "Look, I'll pay for my food, my drink. Please don't throw me out." He says, "I want you out of here." He says, "I'll pay for half the party. Just please let me stay. It's going to be so embarrassing for me to be thrown out." Host says, "I don't care. I want you out." He says, "I'll pay for the entire party. Whatever it costs to throw this party, I'll pay for it." The host says, grabs him by the hand, and starts to lead him out. And he literally gets thrown out into the gutter. And he starts to think in his head, and the Gemara says, as it relates to the story, Omar, Hoel v'hu Yasve Rabbanon, since the rabbis were sitting there, V'lo machu bey, and they didn't say a word, Shema minakah nichalahu. So they must have been okay with it. And his anger is not even directed at his host. His anger is directed on the rabbis that were standing there, on the rabbis that didn't stand up and say, "Look, maybe there's a better way to solve this. Maybe there's a way not to embarrass him." They all kept quiet. So he starts to devise a plan. Bar Kamsa goes to Caesar and says, "The Jews, they don't really like you." He said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I'll prove it. If you send them a sacrifice, you send them an animal, they won't sacrifice it." So Caesar sends a sacrifice with Bar Kamsa, an animal. And Bar Kamsa makes a blemish in the animal that he knows would never be accepted in the Beis HaMikdash. And when he gets there, the Rabbanan understand what's going on. They see what's going on. And they decide, it says in the Gemara, Savar Rabbanan, L'kurvei mishum shalom malchus. We should give this karban. We know it's the wrong thing to do, but we should do it because there's so much at stake. Shalom malchus. They understood that there could be consequences. Amar lahu Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulis. Rabbi Zechariah says the following: Yamru bale mumin krivin legabe mizbeach. If you do that, then people will say, "Oh, it's no problem to take animals with blemishes and to give them as sacrifices on the altar." Can't do it. Savila Mikdalei, Doleze Lema. They said, "Let's kill Bar Kamsa because he's going to go back," and they understood what was going to happen. Amr Rabbi Zechariah pops up again and says, Yamu Matil Mikachim Yarog. People will then say that when you give a carbon with a moon with a blemish on it, when you give a sacrifice with a blemish, that you need to kill the person. Amr Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan comes in here to judge the psak, the Jewish law that was decided by Rabbi Zechariah. The humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulis. Hechrives Beisenu has destroyed our home. The Sarfa es Hechalenu has destroyed the temple of Higlisanu Meratzenu, and was responsible for us being thrown out because they did not give this sacrifice. Terrible tragedies happened, which ultimately led to the destruction of the temple. Now, this seems to be very extreme. I understand what Bar Kamsa did, how terrible it was. I understand what the host did and how terrible that was, and especially the Rabbanan that had stood there and didn't say a word as Bar Kamsa was embarrassed. But to say that Rabbi Zechariah, to say that he was responsible for the destruction, It doesn't make any sense. All he did is give psak, and truth be told, it's the correct psak. He spoke up and gave their correct Jewish law. Why was that so terrible? The Hamaritz Chayes gives an incredible explanation. He says that Rabbi Zechariah's problem was his modesty. That Rabbi Zechariah should have and understood what should have been the correct psak. The correct Jewish law decision should have been to save the Jewish people. He should have spoke up, and he should have said, look, I understand we have all these issues, but this is a time where we need to do something different. And the Hamaritz Chayes says, which is unbelievable, he says the reason he didn't do this was because he said, who am I? Gadol Ador to make that decision. He was worried. He was embarrassed. What if the other rabbis say, look at what this guy Rabbi Zechariah did. He gave this psak. He's a no good guy. He's terrible. He was worried about what they would say about him. And because of the potential embarrassment, he didn't do what was right. He didn't give the psak that in his heart he knew should have been given. And he allowed the Beis HaMikdash to be destroyed because he didn't have the courage to step forward. Rabbi Zechariah suffered from a disease, which I would call the who am I disease. Who am I? Who am I to do this, to get involved, to step up? And I think that this disease, called the who am I disease, stems from a tremendous lack of emunah bitachon. Because the Almighty places us in situations for us to speak up, to do the right thing, in spite of potential embarrassment. The Almighty put rabbis in the room with Bar Kamsa, and their job was simply to stand up and say, look, we can't do this. We can't embarrass him. The Almighty God put Rabbi Zechariah in a place to give the psak that would save the Beis HaMikdash. And the Hamaritz Chayes says he didn't do that simply because he was embarrassed. Embarrassment is no excuse to not do the right thing. We learn throughout the Bible, throughout the Chumash, when Avram Avinu stands up for his nephew Lot and goes to war to rescue him. It would have been much easier to just ignore the situation. But Avram was setting a standard that Jews don't stand on the side when something wrong is happening. Avram even argued for stone for people that he knew were wicked. He stepped forward and he stuck up for them. Because Jews can't keep silent. We need to speak out. Yehuda protesting to let Binyamin go, and Yosef wants to take Binyamin and put him in jail, and Yehuda steps up at the end of the Sefer Bereshis. What would have been if Yehuda had just said, I don't know, should I get involved? Binyamin, maybe we'll figure out another way. Yehuda steps forward, and he does the right thing, because that's what Jews do. We do the right thing. And it's not by coincidence that you find Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, the Navi, the prophet, that is constantly talked about on Tisha B'Av. The reason we constantly talk about him, to the exclusion of so many other Nevi'im that played a role, is because he always told the truth. And it got him in trouble all the time. He was thrown in a dungeon and almost starved. He was thrown in a pit and almost died. But he never stopped telling the truth. Because Jews, first and foremost, need to tell the truth. We need to stand up for what's right. And when we don't stand up for what's right, terrible things happen to our people and to the world. Rabbis especially must always stand up. Even when people on the other side are using God's name and saying we have to give this person a hard time, we need to heckle and scream and yell. Rabbis need to stand up first and foremost. And in our shuls and schools, we need to stand up. I'll tell you a story that I witnessed in a shul many, many years ago. There was a bar mitzvah. And it was a beautiful bar mitzvah. It was a bar mitzvah of a child, of parents who had not gone to day school. And he had practiced and practiced to read the Haftorah. And he came in, and not only did he do the Haftarah, but he did Musaf as well. And as he was reciting Musaf, he did it with a sing-song. And it was going on because he was singing the words, and it was taking longer than it might usually take. And I remember seeing in the back of the room some of the Chevra, some of the Jews there, some of the Orthodox Jews. They started to sing along. But it wasn't in celebration of God. It wasn't in celebration of the Bar Mitzvah boy. It was in a mocking way. Because shul that Shabbos was going to take an extra 10 or 15 minutes. And everyone knows there's no greater sin in the world than to lengthen the time of davening. And I sat there and I was so upset and frustrated in our shuls that something like that could happen. How many fights do we have over Shalashudis? How many fights do we have over the length of davening? How many fights do we have over the tunes of davening? We need to stand up, and most of us are not involved in the fights. It's the few. But how many of us stand up and say, look, you can't do that in shul? That's not the way we work in the Jewish people. We celebrate spirituality. We don't make fun of it. In our schools, so many times, there's an epidemic in today's world of bullying. How many of us have seen or remember when we were kids or heard stories from our own kids of bullying? Kids that make fun of each other's looks, of their weight, of the way they do things. So many of our kids are in an awkward stage when they're growing. And so many times they're made fun of. And again, there are two people involved, maybe a few others, but it's a minority. It's not most of the class in our schools. But what is the rest of the class doing, the other 90%? Are we teaching our kids to stand up for kids that may not be so cool? Are we teaching them to stand up for kids that may be overweight? Are we teaching them to stand up for kids that get made fun of? Because that's the job of a Jew. And we need to remember on Tisha B'Av that that's our job. Because when we don't do this job, when we don't step forward and show respect to others and defend others, terrible things happen. I'd like to close with a story which has always been very moving to me about the Yom Kippur War that was fought. And of course, many people know the Yom Kippur War that we fought in the north against Syria when they had so many tanks, hundreds of tanks, versus very few tanks on our side. There was a fellow there named Avigdor Kalani. And Avigdor Kalani was a tank commander. And the famous story where he gathered up his troops and gave them over the radio a Mussar Shmuz that they had to go to the top of the ridge, fighting in a place which is called appropriately and appropriate for this day of Tisha B'Av, Emek HaBacha, the Valley of Tears. A place where so many tears were shed because so many of our boys lost their lives defending Jews. And Avigdor Kalani gives the Mussar Shmuz and he rallies his troops and they go to the top of the ridge and they fight and they fight and they fight. And his own brother died in Sinai. They wouldn't even tell him because they needed him there fighting. And when it was over, they had held back the Syrians from going on to Sfat and Tveria. And he literally was a hero of Israel. But there's another piece to this story. If you read the books about Avigdor's life, you read that when he originally went to the army, his father said to him, Avigdor, you can go to any part of the army. I don't want you in a tank. Because his father's job had been pulling out bodies, charred bodies from the tanks that were destroyed. Avigdor said, it's no problem, I'm going to be a pilot. There's no issue there. He goes to be a pilot. He had an issue with his hearing. Can't do that. He says, that's okay, I'm going to be infantry. He goes to be infantry. Turns out he has flat feet. Can't be an infantry. He tries to get into every part of the army. And nothing's working for him. So he finally winds up in a tank. And as religious Jews, we know that God put Avigdor Kalani in that tank so that all those years later, he would be able to go up that ridge and defend us in Emek HaBacha, in the Valley of Tears. But what's important to remember is that God didn't make him go up that ridge. God put him in a place where he could make a difference to the Jewish people. And we thank God every day that he did, because he saved countless lives. He looked into his heart and he went up there to save the Jewish people. We have to learn that lesson on Tisha B'Av. That we have to look inside of our hearts and we have to figure out God puts us in places to make a difference. God put the Rabbanim at that party with Bar Kamsa to make a difference. He put Rabbi Zachariah there to make a difference. Avram, Yirmiyahu, all these people, we are where we are today to make a difference. And that difference will always be, in all our days on this earth, will always be to stick up for those that are weaker than us, to make sure that people don't tease other people, to make sure they don't make fun of them, to make sure that every Jew, no matter how religious they are or if they're not religious, is that we're a unifying force to bring them together, because that's what this day is all about. This day is about our failures as Jews, our failures in our mission in this world. And the only way to correct it is by bringing all Jews together. Thank you.